I want to thank everyone for being able to join us in this OBNA Tigray panel, Journalism During War, Navigating a Blackout, Censorship During the Tigray Conflict. Uh, Omna Tigray is a nonprofit organization dedicated to educational advocacy, and amplifying the voices of affected people in the Tigray region of Ethiopia. I'm going to be the moderator. My name's Nicholas Kariuki Gizuku. I'm an associate professor of African history at City University of New York, Queens in New York, and uh, I'm going to begin by asking our two panelists, Getcho and Ada, to briefly introduce themselves and tell us for how long they have been reporting the conflict in Tigray, and also perhaps tell us if you have covered a war zone before, and if so, how is the conflict in Tigray different? What makes it different, and has it been difficult to get news out of that region? Over to you, Getachew and Ada, in any order.
Either after you.
So I'm Ada Peralta, and I'm Africa correspondent for NPR. I've been covering Ethiopia for about 6 years, and the conflict in Tigray from the very beginning. I think we'll dive a little deeper into this. I mean, I've covered conflict in other African countries, and I just came off of a 1-month stint covering the conflict in Ukraine. And I mean, I'll just open by saying that the stress of covering the Ethiopian conflict is so much greater than that of covering the war in Ukraine. And part of that is because of the challenges with journalism in Ethiopia. Part of it is that getting to the truth in Ethiopia is probably one of the hardest things that you can do. Nick, I'll let you dig more into that later, I assume.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you, Omna, as well for this opportunity. So, my name is Getachew Asafa, and I'm the founder and host of UMD Media. I never covered any war zone, but at a young age, grade 10, 1988, April 8, I still remember. After a long period, I was in a war zone in Tigray, and it was a Good Friday where I was in that small town. There were people gathered from the countryside to get aid, and at 2 p.m., at that time, the central government of Ethiopia sent MiG fighters to bomb that town where people were gathering in our orphan center. And that day, over 100 people died because of this bombing. So I witnessed that. And my mom, my sister, we had to run to flee the town to save ourselves. So that trauma, that experience at a young age followed me all through. In my day job, I'm a full-time professor of sustainable design at the University of Calgary. But because of the war and building on my previous experience of writing weekly on sustainability issues in Ethiopia, I jumped into founding this media, UMD Media, which stands for Understanding, Measuring, and Doing, maybe speaking to the challenges I see in what Eder was speaking about, the getting to the truth and informing the people about the war in Tigray. Thank you, Nick.
Right. Thank you, gents, for that introduction, respectively. And perhaps, and these are a diversion, I have sample questions that I have prepared, but it's interesting that Ada, you've had prior experience working and reporting the war in Ukraine, and you've told us that you find the conditions and circumstances in Tigray to be stressful. What makes it different? What makes it difficult?
I mean, I think, look, there is a pretty systematic attempt to keep reporters from doing their job in Ethiopia, and I mean, that's across the country. I think, not just. I think Tigray is the prime example because there's a de facto blockade. There's a telecommunications has been turned off, and reporters are just simply there's no way really to get into Tigray. So one thing, right? One thing is just the sort of geographical nature of this conflict. That in other conflicts, in other international conflicts, you would have usually some way to get into a rebel-held region through a third country, right? I think here you have to the north, you have Eritrea, right? To the west, you have Sudan. To the south and to the east, you have Ethiopia, right? And the western part of Tigray has been taken by Eritrean and Amhara militias, right? And so there's no way in there. Through, Eritrea is aligned with the government, so there's no way in through there. And, to the east and the south, you have the Ethiopian government who controls your movements, right? And they have said you cannot go into Tigray. So just beginning with that, there's no third country through which you can get into, right? And with the comms blackout, it's impossible. Ukraine, you fly into Poland, you drive, across the country, you hand your passport, and you go, right? It took, the military requires an accreditation. I sent an email with a letter and I had the accreditation back the next day, right? You're allowed to take in all the equipment that you might need as a journalist. You're allowed to take personal protective equipment, so body armor, helmet, sat phones, trackers, right? In Ethiopia, all of that is controlled. They might let you into Ethiopia, but they will not let you in with any personal protective equipment. And I'm pretty sure they know that it would be very difficult to get near a front line, right? Or to cross a front line without that equipment, right? I think the risks sort of immediately goes sky high, right? And so that makes it difficult. And in Ukraine, I mean, I was in Kharkiv, which is, not far from the Russian border, and you're worried about shells, right? You're worried about actual physical danger, right? The firepower in Ukraine is enormous. The firepower in Ethiopia it's lesser, right? I mean, you do have air raids, but they're much lower caliber, right? You do have, artillery, but it's much less of it. But what weighs on you at every moment when you're in Ethiopia is, when am I going to get arrested, right? And that, I think, psychologically makes it so stressful, because you're also getting phone calls, right? Checking in, where are you? What are you doing, right? You have to get a paper signed in every little inch of country that you touch, right? Because your movements are that controlled, right? And so that, I think, just makes it the whole time that you're there, you're sort of you're holding your breath in some weird way, and not strangely because of the physical danger, right? So that's, I think, what makes it different.
Right. Interesting. Getachew, I don't know whether you are in country in Tigray in the region, but I'm tempted to think that you probably do not have the same challenges since you're at home, you're there. Or what's your experience?
In fact, the kind of journalism we do here, I do in the UMD media, is what you can call advocacy journalism. At the same time, when I look at what Eder was speaking to in terms of access and blockade and so on, I still believe, after even 598 days since November 4, 2020, I don't think there is a good understanding of the extent and depth of this blockade. Given that we are not even talking about, journalism, we are talking about even access to resources for those who normally are well resourced. I'm a professor. I have had, professors I know in Tigray, they don't have access to their money, to their own account. And I'm mentioning this because it has an implication to just accessing information and, knowing what is going on, and so on. So the last I remember, I could be corrected if I'm wrong, there was an effort from a Belgian, journalist who made it through Western Tigray. That was maybe over a year old now, right? So we have no clue on what is really happening there, because the blockade, the siege is well resourced. And like Eder was mentioning, it's, 360 well, protected and so on. So for me, the other dimension has been protecting our sources, even outside Tigray. So there is an experience I have had where, when there was a mention of imprisonment, mass arrest of Tigrayans outside Tigray within Ethiopia, and whenever a media points to a specific location, the imprisoned people, get more, punishment from the people who are imprisoning them, because they say, you have leaked, you are the one who, told this media or that media about the situation here. So there is this, dilemma of reporting, doing journalism, but at the same time make no harm, to the sources we have had, even in the rest of Ethiopia. So it's a very complicated situation where access to sources is one thing, and the other one, for me, with the kind of advocacy journalism I do, I want also access of my material, our journalism, to Tigray, which is another challenge, because, people don't have access to internet, and we don't have satellite access. So it's, both the input side and the output side challenge I have been facing over the last 598 days, so to speak.
Oh, interesting, interesting. At the beginning of the year in February, there was an article in African Arguments talking about the ways in which the Ethiopian government is manipulating the media. And two of these four ways are the four ways in which the Ethiopian government is manipulating the media have to do with some of the things that you mentioned. The other two ways being campaigns criminalizing individuals. The most infamous case being the almost nonstop assault on the Director General of the World Health Organization, who is Tigrayan, Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, which is something that revealed a perfect storm of the criminalization of Tigrayan identity and the various strategies that the government is employing to censor humanitarian organizations. The other one has to do with the politicization of humanitarian organizations, with the government, for example, ridiculously claiming that humanitarian organizations and Western governments are actively supporting the TPLF, or recasting the civil war as a righteous struggle between Abiy's regime and neo-colonialists. But I would want us to focus some more on the policing of international coverage, the denying of international reporters access to the Tigray region and harassing of foreign media workers, expulsion of journalists, for example, New York Times, Simon Marks, encouragement of censorship, accusations leveled at international media regarding, orchestrating campaigns of misrepresentation by reputable outlets. And of course, both of you have mentioned the communications blackout, the muzzling of domestic media, for example, the case of our Media Center. I want us to perhaps dig a little deeper. Are there any specific experiences that you've heard of about targeted harassment and expulsion, denial of access, or even the assassination of journalists that you could mention?
I think there's a lot of examples. I mean, especially over the past, just from the start of this conflict, right? I mean, it began with, the arrest of many Tigrayan journalists, and then just in this past month or so, right, there's been a mass arrest of Amhara journalists. You had just recently the expulsion of the Economist correspondent in Ethiopia. And I'll tell you, I actually just came out of Ethiopia, and we were at a WFP press conference, and the number of independent journalists in Ethiopia had shrank to, I counted 5, right? So Ethiopia is the second most populous country on the African continent. If you go to any sort of major press conference in Nairobi, right, it is crawling with journalists. In Kampala, crawling with journalists, both domestic and international. And in Ethiopia, you had a sort of major press conference with the executive director of the World Food Program, and there was literally 5, right? And I think, again, I think this is systematic. I'll tell you that when I was in, this was last year, I was in a city called Desi, which is in Amhara, and the TPLF was making, they were making an advance toward the city. They were about to take over the city. And what happens is there is sort of an orchestrated messaging campaign that happens that that starts talking about imperialism and starts talking about the United States backing, the TPLF, that starts talking about foreigners backing the TPLF. And literally on the streets of Desi, what happens is regular Ethiopians, right, start ganging up against you. So you're on the streets and suddenly there's a mob surrounding you, right? Because you're making whatever is happening happen, they say, right? Even though all you're doing is just literally saying what you've seen. So I think what happens in Ethiopia is these threats come from so many different angles, and the sort of core part of it is fear. And right now in Ethiopia, there is, I don't speak Amharic, I don't speak Tigrinya, I don't speak Afan Oromo, right? So we need local journalists to help us and Ethiopians to help us to get our jobs done. And right now there is fear has taken a hold in Ethiopia in a way that I had not experienced since the end of the EPRDF days, times, which is when when sort of at the end of that regime's time, where paranoia was incredible, right? It had taken hold in Ethiopia, and I think we're at that same stage. We did this little experiment where we stood in Meskel Square in Addis Ababa, which is, it's the central part of the city where people just, they hang out, they sit, they run, they eat, they talk, they chat, right? People just hang out there. And we stood there for about an hour and a half, just to see how many people would talk to us. No one would, right? Everyone would say, sorry, I'm too scared. And I think that makes it really hard for journalists to operate. It makes it really hard to get to the truth.
Interesting. Getachew, do you want to add something on that too?
Yeah, no, if I may, the picture Eder is painting. I know governments in the past in Ethiopia have been, imprisoning journalists and acting against media, all that. What's unique now, that never maybe happened at this scale before, is there are as well non-state actors that intimidate, make these journalists, people to speak to journalists, fear for their life. And that for me has been very worrisome, given that even, forget Tigray, which was like we said, under 360 siege blockade, information blackout. Even in Addis, Mescal Square, I know that square, and it's the largest square in the country. And that is, where you would see or expect some openness, given that even if there are surveillance cameras that are installed there, still, where you would see at least people feeling free to speak to journalists. But I can understand, because it was openly declared that anyone who is promoting these, what they labeled as terrorists, Tigray forces, Oromia, OLA, all that, they were criminalized by the state media, supported by non-state actors, and including, 24/7, justified by the support bid of the prime minister in diaspora as well. So about murdering journalists, we can mention David Kabada, who was the journalist in the Tigray television. He was murdered in Maqala. Actually, last year, maybe some months ago, a group of journalists, media outlets, we came together to issue a press release. And we mentioned, among others, David Kabada in Maqala, who was murdered, and others as well, and all this. And now it has went into a different scale, like Eder was mentioning. Anyone who is speaking, about what's going on in Tigray, outside Tigray, we can mention Ethiopia Forum. That was a media outlet that gives a perspective on every time the prime minister makes a speech. They give an analysis that show, in terms of digging into what he said before on the same topic, or what the reality on the ground is, what really the reality people are in, and so on. So they are imprisoned. Yeah, Eder mentioned about Aulo Media and a number of medias that are either imprisoned, shut down, and so on. So what I'm seeing is where when you shut down this, the government has been opening is a disinformation, a misinformation campaign, that anyone, if I post something on my social media, I would have countless number of trolls going after me, not on the subject I'm talking about, not on the substance of it, but on just threatening me in terms of what I'm saying and why I'm saying that and so on. So this is, I think, a very coordinated campaign, well resourced, and there was state media saying, even if journalists on the ground, for example, July last year, Declan from New York Times, he was in Magala, and you remember that picture on the POWs that were paraded in Magala, and the general went on state media saying, this is just photoshopped from the great run of Ethiopia. This is where people from different walks of life on the largest square, again, Mescal Square, run. I think that 10K, I guess, meters. So he said, without any consideration of what this might imply, that he said this is Photoshop. There was no, POWs of that number in Magala and so on. So you can see that shutting down, imprisoning, and killing, and then with that, just disinforming and misinforming the public was what we were seeing over the past 2 years.
Oh, wow. I have a question on propaganda and disinformation, but it's interesting that you're mentioning, you're talking about the Photoshop of that prisoner of war photo, lies, blatant lies from the government. Ada before you was talking about accusations about Western humanitarian organizations being branded imperial, of being imperialist, and actually, it's unbelievable the temerity of the Ethiopian government. The extent that it will go to propagate such blatant lies. I mean, we'll all remember the social media campaign claiming that the United States Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, was somehow an agent of the TPLF. And so, these are very grave issues that you guys are sharing with us. And we pray that you guys and your colleagues are going to be safe. But just a quick follow-up. There is news that, and I don't know whether it's, again, propaganda. There's news that there has been a lull and unilateral declaration of ceasefire, humanitarian ceasefire by the government. Has it eased the access? Has it eased reporting? What has been your experience?
It has eased. It has certainly, many more aid trucks are getting into the Tigray region. I think the ceasefire seems to be real. There seem to be moves toward some sort of negotiation between the government and the TPLF. As far as journalism, I just came back from Ethiopia. I was not allowed to go to Tigray. That's still very much, the government just doesn't allow you to go there. I mean, talking about the misinformation, though, I think is really, really important, because there are basic questions that we don't know the answer to in a war that is going on a year and a half. For example, we don't know how many people have died in this conflict. And I think, and it's easy for the sort of political groups in Ethiopia to manipulate the information, because there's no independent journalists, right, in Tigray, who are able to get news out. So there's a void, and it can be filled with many things, right? And I think if there were journalists in Tigray right now, more than one, right, we would actually know what the effect of a de facto blockade has been, right? All we have right now is what the humanitarians tell us, and what the humanitarians tell us is very little and limited. I mean, even the sort of agency that's supposed to make scientific decisions on whether there's a famine or not says that they don't have enough information to say whether there's a famine or not, because they're not allowed to go in and conduct the sort of surveys that they have to conduct to figure out how many people are dying of hunger in order to declare a famine, right? So I think that just tells you how deep the problem goes, that there's basic questions that we don't have answers to. And so the situation is ripe for manipulation, right? Because the government can say there's no one dying in Tigray of hunger. And that is what the government has said, right? And the aid agencies say, no, actually, there is people who are dying of hunger. And sometimes you can make connections with, one of the big hospitals in Mekelle, and they might tell you something, right? And that's sometimes, right? But then it's sort of easy to attack any of these reports because everybody just accuses each other of being biased. Whereas in any normal situation, you would have 50 reporters, 100 reporters, 1,000 reporters, right? Feeding pictures and video and interviews with people from different cities in Tigray, across Ethiopia, where the truth would sort of be undeniable. And I think what has been created in Ethiopia is a void of information. So it allows political actors to take advantage of it.
Right. And so the picture that is emerging is that it's quite obvious that the Ethiopian government has sought to discredit reports and to insert disinformation into the media ecosystem. Uh, and this disinformation then gets replicated, perpetuated, and amplified, thereby confusing the international perception of the situation in Tigray and the war. And of course, deflecting attention from the ongoing humanitarian crises and human rights violations. How are you, as individual journalists and the media organizations that you represent, been navigating or combating or dealing with these disinformation attempts?
Nika, if I may add as well to that dimension that Ada was speaking to, if you look at what the government successfully did over the past, 19 months, it made sure that it's very dangerous to tell the truth. And that's not only for journalists, as we mentioned, but also for the public. And that reminds me the book by Jim Acosta. That is he was the CNN chief White House correspondent. In his book, The Enemy of the People. That's exactly actually what happened in Ethiopia, where Abiy Ahmed has made journalism or journalists, media that want truth, like Eder was mentioning, just asking the right questions and digging into the answers. That is, enough for the government to label these are enemy of the people. So we remember the No More movement, all that. It was against media, against journalism, against whoever is asking the right questions and so on. So, and for me, like I said, there is a balance act because whenever you dig for more information and you are worried that your sources could be, because you communicate through phone and through this or that, and you feel that the government is hearing, seeing, reading all this, and what will happen next. So there are experiences where we couldn't hear, or I didn't hear for long from my sources, and I learned that they were imprisoned for 60 days and so on, with no one telling where they were imprisoned and so on. So that is enabled by the silence of the international community, I must say. You mentioned about the unilateral humanitarian truce. We covered on UMD Media from sources that were privy to what happened, really. It was not unilateral. There was an agreement. There was a decision, actually, for both parties to come together at the same time on media and say what they agreed upon, and even not to have the humanitarian aid as a condition, all that. But then the government in Addis decided to go it alone and so on. So those who coordinate this know this very well. I mean, the US government, for example. But again, understandably, in some cases, with the complexity of the issue, with the Horn, and with what's happening elsewhere in Ethiopia as well, as we speak, there is a lot of things happening in Amhara region, Oromia, Gambela, Benshangul, all over the place. So they chose to, again, not tell the truth or inform the public what should be informed. So the challenge is big for small medias with limited resources to do anything about it. But what we know for sure is the public would benefit from getting into the right questions asked and getting the right answers. And we cannot get any numbers in terms of, okay, how is aid being distributed. We heard, for example, yes, food is coming in smaller quantities, but there is, for example, a shortage of fuel to get this whatever small amount is getting in to get distributed to the people in need. So all these are important things, important information to get out of Tigray. But again, we don't have that access. Compare it to the 17 years of war, between TPLF and the central government of Ethiopia at that time. There were, even at that time, I'm talking about 1975 to 1991. So even at that time, there was a possibility for journalists to sneak in, through Sudan and so on. And we have these important books written by journalists at that time, like Fire from the Ashes, the chronicle of, I think, the revolution in Tigray, written by Jenny Hammond. So you get that, details of the famine of 1984, 85, what happened then, and so on, because journalists were able to go in, even if there was a lot of difficulty as well. Our own Canadian journalist was able to go as well to Tigray and report at that time. That moved, the Prime Minister of Canada at that time, has written in a very interesting book written by a number of journalists, Canadian journalists, how in the residence of the Prime Minister at that time, there were people crying, tearful, even in their prime time reporting, journalists in newsroom were tearful at that time as well. So come, to where we are today, at this day and age, we have that, blockade where we cannot say a lot about what's going on within Tigray.
Thank you so much for that comprehensive take, Getachew, and thanks actually for the correction that the ceasefire, the humanitarian ceasefire, was not unilateral. And again, this points to the kind of disinformation that is taking place there. And of course, you mentioned, sort of contrasting the press freedoms that are non-existent now with the kind of press freedoms that were there in the early 1980s, which reminds me of the important work of the photojournalist, the Kenyan photojournalist Mo Amin, at the time, in terms of getting out information about the 1984 famine. Right. Before we go to the next question, I don't know whether, Ada, you have anything to add in terms of how you're navigating these as an individual journalist and as a media house.
I think something that you said that I think is important is we worry about our sources, right? Because likely the consequences for me, right, are nothing compared to the consequences for a source. And I mean, and just so you know how things are working at this point in Ethiopia, a lot of the interviews are like in hotel rooms, right? You can't even be out in the field anymore, right? Doing interviews. Again, and this is not necessarily new in Ethiopia, right? I think during the EPRDF times we would do interviews in cars, right? So I here we are doing interviews in hotel rooms, people fearful to be seen with you, to have the government, whether they're watching or not, right? It's not even clear to me when they watch and when they don't watch, right? But the paranoia right now in that country is immense. And the sources are terribly scared that they're going to spend years in jail. And no one wants to do that. And you have to wonder, you always have to weigh, how much is this story worth putting those people at risk, right? And, what I will say is what I look back to is the civil war in South Sudan. Where many of the same dynamics happened with journalism, right? The South Sudanese regime basically blocked off the country in huge ways. They would not let journalists in. I went in on a tourist visa trying to do reporting because they wouldn't give me accreditation, and I wasn't doing reporting. I just went in there to try and convince them to let me do reporting, and they threw me in jail instead. But what happened in that conflict is they put so much fear into journalists that we didn't cover that conflict. And then years later, scientists came in and did an excess mortality study. And what they found was that 400,000 people were killed in that conflict. And as a journalist in Ethiopia, that's my fear, that we're not doing enough to understand the scale of this thing. And like, my fear is that years from now, some scientist will come and do an excess mortality study, and we may figure it out that this was more horrific than we ever imagined. I mean, I can't tell you if it's truly that horrific because I don't know. I don't have access. I can't get in there to tell you that. But my fear is that we may find that out when it's too late.
Right. That's a sad anticipation, and I think the word fear and paranoia has cropped up time and again in this discussion, which leads to another question. Have you felt the need perhaps to censor yourself in fear of losing your license in Ethiopia or losing access to the region?
I mean, I'll tell you, I get that you, let me jump in here. I will tell you that what it has made me do is try not to report on try not to rely on phone reporting, because because this is such a polarized country at the moment, right? That that you can, if you're in a refugee camp in Sudan, which I've been to, right? You can talk to 50, 60, 70 people really fast, and you can sort of get some ability to understand the truth a little bit. But over the phone, it's hard to talk to 50, 60, 70 people, right? So then the truth, it's really hard to get at what the truth really is. And so what I've ended up, and what we as NPR have ended up deciding is we want to report what we can actually see or report really deeply. And that means that we ignore a lot of things, and that I think is also dangerous.
Getachew, you want to jump in on the same question?
Yeah, it's interesting, the way I report it out in terms of being selective. I'm always overwhelmed, with the if there was anywhere in the world right now where you can do good journalism, getting into the bottom of things, understanding the context, the details, and reporting in real time, it would have been Tigray. For me, when the war started, maybe what we knew was limited, and you can be, just focus on one subject matter. After that, with are you going to cover the mass rape? Are you going to cover the health issue, the destruction of education, the children, the mass arrest, the concentration camps? The plate is full, and at the same time, we both mentioned about our sources and the security, and basic journalism is about no harm, to anyone, not least to sources, right? So all that complicates it. I don't have a license to operate in Ethiopia. I don't need that because I do it from where I am. But my sources, those who are living witness of what's going on, are there. So yes, I do self-censorship a lot for one reason or another, among other things. Like I said, the victims, the sources, and in some cases our sources are the victims themselves, and re-traumatization is what you don't want to do because they are living in that trauma and telling you, and witnessing about their own and other people's suffering, and what they saw, what they are living in, makes you too much to carry on, and so on. I can tell you just what happened this morning. I mean, even on personal level, right? So my mom and my sister used to watch me on media outlets. Very few media outlets have viewership on satellite in Tigray. For some reason, they didn't see me there because I cannot call them. They cannot call me easily. So my sister went 300 kilometers out of her town to get phone access and to call me, check if I'm okay. You can see that even just the personal level, the family level is so big that people are going through. And if you just add the journalistic layer there or the media layer there, it becomes again, okay, do I feel, comfortable even in mentioning the towns, the times, locations of, these sources? No. So there is a lot of self-censorship. On top of that, the resources that we can, talk about all day long. But that fear, the government, planned and implemented, I think unfortunately it has been very successful, not only in people fearing to talk to media, to journalists, but also in media and journalism as well, to self-censorship and be selective on what we can do and what we have been doing.
Wow, that sounds like it really compounds the amount of information accessible and actually limits our understanding of what's happening. There is apparently clearly state censorship, there is self-censorship that is really limiting the credibility of reporting, which is an unfortunate situation. Um, it's interesting also to hear your own experience, Gertrude, this morning, and which leads me to something actually that is not in my list of questions. Where can we catch your reporting on this conflict? If you just tell us where to
So,
find you.
so on my end, you can. I mean, it's on the radio. It's on in the U.S. It's across public radio stations, but on npr.org you can find it. I will say this. Um, as much as we've talked about censorship and about intimidation, about access, the truth is known of what is happening in Ethiopia. There has actually been really amazing reporting, right, in this conflict by a lot of people, right? I mean, even from places that are disputed, right? Even that there was a UN Ethiopian Human Rights Commission report, right, that was put out, widely maligned by both sides. But there was a footnote in that report that said that in Western Tigray, hundreds of thousands of Tigrayans were forcefully pushed out of their lands, right? I think there is enough truth out there that the world cannot say they didn't know what happened in Ethiopia during the civil war, right? We don't have the clarity that we have in Ukraine, right? Because there's not thousands of reporters there, doing live shots from every single place in the front line, right? But enough is known, I think, that we understand the contours of what's happening in Ethiopia. And I think the world has enough information to make decisions, I think. So I think in the end, they cannot say they didn't know.
Good.
Yeah, that's
Very encouraging.
yeah, that's a
Get
good
it, Joe.
point. On actually, one of the things that those who are in Washington, in Brussels, they know better. They have access what normal media organizations don't have access to. But unfortunately, I think the politics. I can tell you about Nick, about an experience November last year, just on the week of, actually a day on the eve of American Thanksgiving. We do have our own Thanksgiving here in Canada as well. So on the eve of American Thanksgiving, I was contacted by the State Department. UMD Media was contacted, and they wanted to come over and talk about what they called at that time, developments in the, peace diplomacy and so on. At that time, Feltman was coming from Addis, and they were part of these discussions and all that, and the Tigray Defense Force were very close in the area of Debrecen, and very close to Addis and so on. So, but when I announced it, Ned Price would be coming over to MD Media to talk about that. There was a coordinated campaign, saying, he shouldn't be there. All that with the campaign, we were talking about the state, Asmara was part of it, Addis, and that's for all that. So one thing that I learned from that experience was they know, like Eder said, they know better. And there is a lot of information they have access to, including the genocide, the ethnic cleansing, all that. But unfortunately, Tigray is the least of their priority. If you add the Ukraine-Russia layer, and then if you look at Eritrea, for example, supporting in all resolutions Russia, not Ukraine, and adding yet another layer to the complexity. So Brussels and Washington are just sitting on the file that they already have. So, but what the media still could have done better, given if you had access, if we had Tigray was open and so on, is for the public in general, for the people around the world. Because I am in Canada and I hear, even if we have been saying this, there were a lot of reports out there, but still people are asking, oh, is it still war? Is it siege, blockade, and so on? So as media and journalists, I think we have a duty, and we want to do that, to inform the public, and for the public, to do what it can and what it wants to do. But we are not in that position. Otherwise, I totally agree. Whether it's, for example, this week, as you know, high official from the European Union went to Makala. I think this is the first time, at least from what we know, that level of official going to Makala. And he was saying, it's too much already. The suffering in Tigray should end and so on. But the question is, what are they going to end that? What are they going to give, media access to all what's happening there and elsewhere?
Right. So it seems that there is a collusion and a conspiracy of several factors that have led to the silence of the international community, and one of them obviously has come up time and again in our discussion. That's the war in Ukraine, that has become an almost everyday staple in global news. So, um, what other factors do you think contribute to lack of enough global interest in what is happening in Tigray today?
I mean, I think the honest answer, right, is that it's Africa. And I think it's, part of the global south, and the global south just does not get the kind of resources and coverage that it should. And I think also the tolerance for risk in covering a conflict like Ukraine, right, which swings gas prices across the world, right, is much higher than it is for covering a conflict like Ethiopia. Um, I think, if Ukraine, for whatever reason, had put in, these same sort of heavy restrictions on journalists, you would have journalists fighting to be the first ones to break that siege, right? You would have journalists absolutely willing to be thrown in jail, or even risk their lives to do something like that. But I think the appetite for risk in covering Ethiopia is actually much lower, and um, I think that benefits the powerful in Ethiopia. It benefits the elites because they get to tell the story however they want.
Right. Getachew, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, a very small point to add is uh, there is also the state narrative. So there is a perception that Ethiopia is too big to fail, and it's the seat of the African Union and a number of continental and international organizations, all that. So with over 110 million people, and the fact that there has been historic, at least the last 20, 30 years, it was considered the hub of stability in that region and so on. So there seems to be um, a kind of consensus within Washington and Brussels that um, just keeping quiet against all odds, even under the massive suffering of civilians in Tigray. As we speak, Nick, it breaks my heart for once a dean of the medical school in Mekelle University. That's the largest university in Tigray, and he the celebrated surgeon. He was tweeting from Tigray, this week through the international, Wi-Fi, all that, saying that he was thanking the US aid for giving him 10 kilos of wheat. We are talking about a professor. We are talking about a surgeon. We are talking about a person not only was helping, through his profession, but he was capable of, in terms of financial even, helping others, thanking USAID for getting 100 kilos of wheat, this week, Nick. So you can imagine the suffering that's happening there. But this is just one region in a big country, and the world, like we said, knows better, but chose to ignore it.
Right. That's a really heartbreaking story. Get a cheer by the professor. Uh, but it's really interesting. Your remark about the state narrative, Ethiopia being too big to fail, and this offers us, a bridge to segue into another question. Uh, and like you said, it is quite astonishing today to see the various crises that are buffeting Ethiopia, which historically is a symbol of black pride, Africanness, Pan Africanism, and freedom, considering that it was never colonized. And these crises, range from Oromia, featuring the Oromo Liberation Front, to the influential armed Amhara youth protest movement, FANO. Uh, how does reporting from Tigray, and I think Ida had mentioned this before, compare to these other regions? Is it the same or is it different?
I'll tell you something that just happened. I was trying to get to Ambo. Ambo is a city. Get that you might correct me here. I think it's about 45 kilometers from the capital, and it was impossible. I tried every avenue. Right. So right now there's quite a bit of fighting between the OLA and the government in the region, west of the capital. Right. But this is literally right there. Right. I mean, this is a tiny distance from there, and we tried, the because you need permission to do everything in Ethiopia, right? Because there's checkpoints, and at the military checkpoints, if you don't have the right piece of paper, you know, you go back or you end up in jail, right? So at worst, they just send you back to Addis. At best, they send you back to Addis. At worst, you end up in jail, right? So we tried every which way, asking the government, the state government, asking even the Oromo Liberation Army, right? Is there a way that we can get to you through this area? Just impossible, right? So I think there was a time not so long ago that Tigray was the sort of forbidden part of Ethiopia, right? That was incredibly difficult, impossible to get into. I think I was one of the last foreign journalists to be in there, right? And that was like a year and a half ago. It was a long time ago, right? But more and more, Ethiopia is becoming impossible to report in outside of Addis Ababa, right? Outside of this tiny bubble in the capital, it's become really difficult. In fact, right now, even if you wanted to go to Amhara right now, it would be really hard to get into Amhara right now. So it is, the media space was closed, and it's closing off even more, like in recent months.
I get at you.
Yeah, I think I concur with that notion. If you look at travel advisories by the UK, US, it's almost the only green area you would see would be Addis, right? So, and the government has you know what you call taken the experience, the bad experience of the past government, and scale that up. So in the past, we have had internet shutdowns, maybe lasting for a few days, and everyone would be against that, right? Even the international community, this everyone would be saying no, this is not acceptable. But now, what's sad about Ethiopia is many of the things went over the roof, that it has been normalized, not getting access to regions outside Ethiopia, be it west, east, north, south, and so on. So it's like Addis and the mass media, I mean the state media, is just normalizing everything. You might, if you follow what you see this week, for example, is the green legacy, and the prime minister, planting seedlings, all that and so on. And what happened in Wollega, based on some sources, over 250 civilians killed. Before that, what did you see in Gambela just few days ago? Again, civilians being killed there, right? The capital of the regional state of Gambela was, at least for a few hours or a day, under the armed forces of OLA and the Gambela, I think, Liberation Front. So all these are journalistic materials. You want to know more, you want to let the public, the people, the world know, but they are happening again under tight scrutiny of the government. Ambo is one of these famous towns, be it 30 years ago or after that, for everything in terms of popular movements, armed conflicts, and so on. So this is an interesting town to be into and ask for what is happening and what's going on, but it's impossible.
Right. I think you guys are. Go ahead, Ada.
Yeah, Nick, it's interesting. The Wolega thing, what happened in Wolega, is really interesting because I could think of no other country, perhaps China, right, where there are reports of 200 plus civilians killed, and journalists stay in Addis Ababa, right? In any other country, journalists would run to this place, and the fear, right? So one, you don't get access from the government. The government tells you can't go, right? But there's no appetite to defy the government in Ethiopia, and I will include myself in there, right? Like I'm not gonna say that I'm fully willing to defy the government. I am, but there needs to be a critical mass, right? So I report a lot in Uganda as well. Uganda is same president for 30 years. When stuff happens, the military comes out into the streets, and beat people, they fire. And what journalists do is everybody gets in a convoy and goes, right? You get to like the military checkpoint and you say, we're journalists, we're going. I mean, literally, like this past elections, in the Ugandan elections, the opposition leaders house was completely surrounded by military. What did we do? We all got together, we said, hey, we're all going at 3, right? We all went at 3 o'clock. We all went. We were chased away, right, by men with guns, but we all went. And I think the appetite to defy the government in Ethiopia, there is no appetite to defy the government. And I, again, this is easy for me to say. I have an American passport. The consequences for me are way less than for Ethiopian journalists. So I understand where the fear, where that fear comes from. But I also sort of wonder, like where is the appetite to head to these stories, to say, you know what, we're going to head toward Tigray as a group and see what happens, right? What are they going to do to us, right? And that just, it's not there. It's hard to do that in Ethiopia.
I think on that point, very short, Nick, if I may. I think the scale of the fear mongering, the imposed, I would say planned and designed fear, if I can use that word, is so huge that they made it impossible for what would normally happen, like I mentioned. So I can talk about what happened to the patriarch, the head of the largest and oldest church in the country, right? The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church. So he happens to be, from Tigray. And can you imagine in these 19 months, he got to speak twice about the Tigray genocide, and he did it through a cell phone of a visitor first time, and second time through a diaspora-based media. Why? Because he was not allowed to air just what he was hearing and seeing on state media or other media. So the silencing machinery, I think, is very easy to underestimate it, but I think it's so huge that it even was successfully silencing the patriarch of that church. And otherwise, Elder, you reminded me what happened, during the APRDF time. There were two Swedish journalists who sneaked into the Somali region, you remember? And, we are talking about a government that even in the past was doing, this silencing and so on, but never at this scale. So now, you don't have anyone, maybe like, the word appetite is the right term, I guess, because if there is a will, I think there would have been a way as well for at least some media outlets. But like I mentioned, the fear is so huge that people are taking the safe, sides, so to speak.
This is really chilling stuff. I mean, coming from the, relative security of academia and intellectual practice, this is really scary stuff. For me, actually, what stands out from listening to both of you in the last 1 hour, talking about paranoia and fear, and silencing machinery, tight scrutiny, scaling up of anti-media measures, the closing up of media space. There's something that is clearly becoming very obvious. Getachew was comparing the situation now with the previous conflict between 1975 and 1991. And you told us earlier that there was openness about what's happening in Ethiopia during that time. So what is coming out also is not just the closing up of media space and public space. It's also a closing up of political space. So what has happened between the early 90s? What has changed between the early 90s and now? Is the government becoming more of a dictatorship or a tyranny? What exactly is happening?
Maybe I can start there. So, I mean, there is, in my view, the government had at that time control on everything, the power, military, everything. And then there was a vibrant opposition. I mean, at least in the diaspora, that was willing to check, in terms of, protesting, opposing, and questioning any move by the government. And then there was a willingness as well from the international community, maybe for ideological or other reasons, to again, look into the humanitarian aspects and have a kind of threshold, so to speak, where they were not allowing for the government to go beyond. But now what we see is, I mentioned once the no more movement. And it's crazy, but people were having the audacity to present the war as African war against imperialism. They were saying, Abiy Ahmed is fighting, African war, when he was, mass killing Africans in Tigray. And they didn't even, question that, how ridiculous that is and so on. But my point is, there is a fertile ground, both regional, local, and global environment under which this government is operating. Unfortunately, I'm not going into the details of the politics of the US, but imagine Abiy Ahmed came after Trump, or during the Trump era, so to speak. So what happened in the US in terms of media, if it was not for the institutions, if it was not, for the democratic, stable institutions, you can imagine what Trump was doing to the media, right? So there seems to be, an understanding or a reading from the Abiy government that, if it happened in the US, why not here? Even, they can do it with impunity, right? They have been doing it with impunity in Ethiopia. So I'm not saying, I cannot even say, because I know I was writing, in a regular column in Addis during the past government. And magazine I used to write, on weekly basis, was shut down, and the journalists were exiled. I'm talking about that time as well, But what's unprecedented and what's new here is the forces, the state and non-state actors working together to silence, to fearmonger, and to uh, stifle all media and so on, is uniquely worrisome. Otherwise, governments historically in Ethiopia were always, okay with media that praise, whatever they are doing and so on, but never at this scale. He is not even, tolerating just anything that would question his policy and so on. Forget about, advocating for victims in all over the country.
I mean, Nick, I will defer to Getachew on the scale, because I think I don't have a good understanding as to the scale. But let me tell you that during the EPRDF days, there was only one way to get into Ethiopia, right? Which is, you would say, we're going to go cover the African Union, right? And then you would go to the African Union, you would stick a little recorder in your pocket, and you would try to get to Oromia, right? Which is where the big protests against the government were happening. was completely closed off. You could sneak around, and they would catch you and tell you, go back to the African Union Hall, right? Nothing was done in the open. We would travel just with a little recorder, right? But right after, Meles dies, there's a short transition, and there's a huge promise, right? I think what Meles had promised is we're gonna transform Ethiopia, and at some point, right, the political space will open up, right? That was his promise. I think he was very open about it, right? And I think what happened in Ethiopia is everyone thought that promise was to come to fruition through this transitional prime minister, right, Abiy Ahmed. And I think that's why the Nobel Peace Prize, right? Even though it was already fraying at that time, that promise, right? I think everyone had sort of imagined that this would be a peaceful, bloodless transition in which the days of an authoritarian regime, in order to sort of move the country into an industrial age, right, gave way to political freedoms. I think everybody thought that moment had come, but what the moment that we find ourselves in Ethiopia is that wasn't true at all, right? And I think a lot of people I spoke to on this last trip to Ethiopia said that it's much worse, right? And again, it's hard to talk to people in Tigray, but I can tell you that a lot of the Oromos I spoke to, who got the wrath of the PRDF government, the wrath, right? I mean, they were thrown in prisons for years. They were, like hundreds of them were put in like schools, and what they say now is that things have actually gotten worse, right? From that time. So I think that sort of that the promise of a new Ethiopia very quickly soured, and I think that makes it also appear so much more intense.
Right. That's an interesting take. I guess even as an East Africanist, as an outside observer of this promise of Ethiopia, I'm really disappointed in the young man, relatively young, who is an age mate, who is seeming obviously to roll back the clock. It does not look good on him. It doesn't at all. If you're joining us from the YouTube stream, and I can see at least a few questions, feel free to put your question in the chat on there, and we are nearing the end of the set sample questions here, and we'll get to those questions in a bit. So the war on Tigray has also been waged digitally. Have you faced increased threats on social media, harassment online after reporting on Tigray, or heard of such experiences? It's interesting, Ada, while I was preparing last night and after the tweet went out from Omna Tigray, I saw a few of your comments on your handle on Twitter, and I saw a post by, I think, one of your colleagues, Halima Athumani, saying that, and these she says were the words of journalists, they are acting like dogs and they are biting. Have you encountered harassment online?
Yeah, I think that's just part of like that's just part of the environment, I think, in Ethiopia. I mean, any story that goes up, just like, it's a barrage, emails, text messages, DMs, all of it. I mean, like, I have just turned off my mentions, because I think it's I don't know, I can't even imagine what you go through, with that, because it's what I get is probably a tiny fraction of what you get. And I think I just I would love to pay attention to it, but I think at a certain point, it starts making you nervous as a reporter, and that's not good for reporting. And so, like, I've even like stopped tweeting because of that, because it's so intense, and it's not just, right, it's not just stuff you get on Twitter, it's the phone calls you get, right? So it makes you a less effective reporter, if you look at it and allow it to put fear in your heart. So I try not to look at it.
Get it, you?
Yeah, I think if you compare it to the first, let's say, 12 months, 18 months, I mean, I can't tell you, even you can clearly see the pattern, the coordination of, the insult, the intimidation, all that was at once. You saw I tweet something, then in a couple of minutes, it's all over the place with that kind of silencing and so on. We are past that stage, and there was a time where I was busy blocking. The reason for the blocking was some of what they were saying is, too much to even read and so on. And there was a study on, this kind of disinformation, coordination, state and non-state diaspora, all that. And there was that concerted effort to picking medias that would question the state narrative, that would ask, for example, there was a lot of contradiction on what the prime minister was saying, even within the same speech. I'm talking about the same speech to the parliament, right? But there were a number of people, the social media army, I call them, that were at any cost defend what the prime minister was saying, again, attacking media's people like me, who were just asking questions or questioning what the state narrative was, and so on. So I have to say that it has now gone south in terms of that, given maybe my reading is after June 2021, this is the month where the Ethiopian forces in significant numbers left Tigray. I mean, we're not talking about Western Tigray, Europe, and so on, which is still under Ethiopian forces, Eritrean forces, and so on. So after that, there is a clear division in the media outlets, who is supporting the state narrative or questioning it, and so on, for different reasons. So there is a significant reduction in trolls, in attacks, insults, all that on social media. So relatively speaking, I am at peace now compared to where I was, let's say, a year ago, Nick.
Thank God for that. Thank God for the peace of mind on social media, and hopefully on all fronts as we forge forward. As you were talking, you mentioned social media army attacks, which reminds me of the indomitable Kenya, I think Kenyans on Twitter, hashtag KOT, who speak with one voice. I see Ada laughing. And it speaks with one voice most of the time. I mean, you probably heard of the popular row between KOT and the IMF just before I think the IMF made a decision to give another huge loan to the government. What's the experience of Ethiopia, the Twitter community? What's the mood like in the country? Do they speak in one voice? What's their attitude towards the violence and the war?
I think that's a really interesting story because or question, because Kenyans on Twitter is grassroots, right? I think the sort of the analog for Ethiopia would be the No More campaign. And Kenyans on Twitter, right? Like they're sort of defending their country, usually against Western portrayals, right? Very fairly so, right? Like when Kenyans on Twitter come after somebody, it's usually for really good reason. I think the thing in Ethiopia is that the online space is dominated by the elite, right? It's not like, it's not an analog to Kenya, where in Kenya it's a much more diversified number of people who are there. And two, I think it's pretty coordinated and funded. I mean, I think there's been studies done that show that it is coordinated and funded. So I think that's the huge difference between Kenyans on Twitter and something like the No More campaign in Ethiopia.
Gratitude.
Yeah, no, I think what happened in Ethiopia in terms of the Twitter social media campaign, actually there was I don't remember the lab, but a digital lab that did a study on that, and they were tracking, how hashtags, all that were coordinated and where they come from and so on. So they were able to track actually from Addis to Asmara, how the Twitter sphere was, coordinated with the state narrative at the center. So whether it's no more or even, for example, one of the things that would come is whenever you are even talking about atrocities committed by the government in Oromia or Amhara, at that time they would say, TPLF is a terrorist, hashtag, So, so everything was like, even where it didn't make any sense at all, they were just throwing it there in a kind of automated and animated manner. So, and like I mentioned, even there was a time where they were bringing South African and known xenophobic person. They were welcoming him on the red carpet at Bole because they were doing everything to do, in this digital war, if you will, in terms of the campaigns and so on. So I think when the dust settles, there is a lot for social science researchers, I must say, when it comes to the social media involvement and how it was coordinated, how at times was contradicting its own narratives and so on, in the just desperate, quest for winning the war there and so on. So in the middle, I think, unfortunately, as always, the victim was truth. The victim was the public interest, civilians, all that. So it is a very dark period, and there are still a number of unknowns. I think there is a lot for people like Unique to maybe dig into the data and hopefully get some insights for what could happen and what should have happened in the future.
Absolutely, get at you. I'm really keen on what's happening in Ethiopia, and we should definitely continue this discussion. I'm actually let me plug in a future event at the end of mid November at the African Studies Association. I don't know, Ada, if you'd be able to attend. The dates are, I think, November 17th to the 19th, and I extend that same invitation to get at you as well as a place where we could look back on this particular event and see what has transpired, whether there's been progress or not, especially as far as the negotiations are concerned. So thank you for the encouragement to have more scrutiny on this particular conflict among others. If you're joining us from the YouTube or Facebook live stream, I encourage those questions to come in. And there are two related questions from YouTube to you guys. Do you think journalists have truly used their maximum potential to cover the conflict? And secondly, do you think encouraging journalists to give more attention would help to reveal the facts? And do you think journalists have truly used their maximum potential? Two related questions.
I mean, I'll say no, right? I think this is a really horrific conflict that deserves much more attention than it has gotten. Um, and and I would say that journalists haven't taken the risks that they probably should have taken to cover this conflict. That's putting a lot of weight on journalists, but I think it's sort of one of our core responsibilities is to bear witness, and we've done very little bearing witness in Ethiopia and Tigray in specific, right? So yeah, I would say a lot of really good work has been done, but not enough, and I don't think news organizations have poured the resources that they should into it, and I don't think journalists have taken the risks that they should.
Get at you.
Yeah, I think we speak to that subject earlier as well. So there is a lot to do, and as I think the book says, there is a lot of work on the field, but the workers are few, right? So whether it's in number or resource, interest, or appetite, I don't mentioned about that. That's relatively small. So I see there is a lot to learn from, and the state narrative. We cannot undermine that Ethiopia, given its history, given its role, in the Horn and in Africa in general, it has a big political capital, but the suffering of civilians, in all directions, I think it merits a lot of attention, and it's in humanity's interest, that gets out and that gets reported. And hopefully for the victims, for those who should be held accountable, should be, held accountable, right? So, but as media and journalists, I think there is a lot still to uncover to bring it. But like Eder mentioned, I'm not here, to undermine what has been done as well. So, great reports that, for example, among others, who knew, about the more than 14 times meeting between Abiy and Isaias Afwerki, in the planning of this war. The dominant narrative has been just, a law and order, operation that would just last few days, right? But unfortunately, we will end up knowing the whole truth, but too late, too little, right? After everything, the suffering, the civilians are, going through all that. So I think timing is very important. And, still for those who are able to, there are a number of journalists that were expelled, including recent ones like Tom Gardner and others. But for those who are there with all they can, I think getting these stories out is important. Maybe, I don't know if we are going to rate that, but a kind of different type of journalism should also be, thought over. I mean, I'm thinking about how we can empower, citizen level journalism, all that, because with the social media, there is a lot of power at the public level, at the citizen level. But how do we do that without compromising, the basic tenets of journalism is, I think, what we should be talking about.
Right. It's interesting that you mentioned citizen journalism, and I had a question about that. But then I thought to myself, there is already a communications blackout since the beginning of the conflict, and I don't, the shutting down of foreign services on the internet. I don't know whether that has changed. And secondly, I think you are talking about the silence of the international community, and Ada has talked about there being an immense weight resting on the shoulders of journalists. What would you tell people who are following this conversation on the internet, and what would would you request them? What role would you request them to play in advocating for peace and an end to the conflict?
I mean, what I would say is this is, we think the United States is polarized, right? But when you're in Ethiopia, like, I mean, that country has just become so polarized. I mean, literally, former friends, right, are not talking to each other um, because of this conflict. And I think what I would say to the people on the internet, right, and actually and to the diaspora, is that this is complicated, right, and this is complex, and it has so many layers, um, and I hope that they have some patience to sort of let journalists do their work, right? I think there's a I think there's a very human want for us to come like to the truth immediately. And this is hard. It's a hard place to get to the truth. So I mean, just like from a journalist perspective, I would just ask for some patience with us, right? That we're trying to get to the truth. It's hard.
Getachew.
Yeah, I think I concur with the complexity of there. So there are a number of layers, like ethnic, religious, regional, political, economic, all that, but I think the best in public interest perspective, the best is to allow journalists, even if there are journalists who are not doing their job, there will be still other journalists who would question that. So it's in the public interest, to open up and then allow journalists to do their business. And at the end of the day, for the public to, to judge whatever is, because the people live their lives, they know their first-hand experience. The story is happening, you know, uh, and the only thing that we could do for the betterment of the lives of the civilians and everyone else is just to get this story out. And you cannot, the thing is, you cannot, last long by shutting down all that. So the blockade, the siege, even if it took a lot of, effort and, cost, it will end sooner or later, right? So there will be a lot of stories to come out. And are we ready, as a country, as people, as world, as a continent to, read the stories that we could have stopped, we could have, avoided, prevented by getting the right story out at the right time and, acting in the right manner, right? So, Nick, if you ask me, I have been in this nightmare for quite so long now, 19 months, but I'm scared of the nightmares that will unleash once the story is out, when things open up.
Yeah, it's a terrible, terrible nightmare. I totally agree. And like you say, I really don't think we are ready. But I think it's very important for the truth to triumph at the end of the day. Another question coming from the internet is: Do you anticipate what do you anticipate the future of journalism to look like in Ethiopia?
I think it's pretty bleak right now, right? I think, I mean, I think there's a full-on assault on journalists and independent journalism at the moment, and I think there's also many journalists have fled, right? Very few have stayed. I think there's a lot of journalists doing really good work from the outside. Um, I don't know how it recovers, when it recovers, but I think the best we can do is echo Getachew, which is, allow unfettered access to journalists, as many as you can possibly get in there, right? And let the truth come out. Um, I think that's a really difficult ask to the Ethiopian government, but it's a sincere ask, right? And I hope that happens.
I guess you, what's the future of Ethiopian journalism?
I wish, I could paint a different picture than what Eder painted, but unfortunately not, because actually kudos to those who are on the ground, Ethiopian journalists, very few of them, but who are reporting truths, and they have been repeatedly, not only once, paying the price. I can speak of Ethioforum again. One of the journalists in that media, he was beaten, physically assaulted and thrown in the outskirts of Addis, and they were, because of this, they were silenced for months, and they came back again and they were started reporting, and now he's in jail again, right? So for some of these journalists, it has been happening, time and again. And this, they have families, they have kids, they have, parents to support themselves. And if you ask me, how much is the price of being a journalist, a true journalist in Ethiopia? I don't know. And who is willing to pay that price, and for how long? And there is a lot of story, like I said, that should be out from all parts of the country, and a lot from Tigray, from Olega, from Gambela, Benshangul, all over the place, Afar, Amhara, and so on. So, I don't know. I mean, it's a bleak picture, and it's a picture that is too much, to accept. But I think there should be an effort to get the truth out, the stories out, let people, speak and get access. One thing that is damaging about what happened on Tigray is the fear mongering. I don't think it's something that will be over, just once everything is even allowed to be accessed, because people will hold, because they knew, they have seen it. Nick, there was just a few weeks ago, there was a video we saw on media, on social media, that who was burned alive, on fire, just alive, right? So imagine, what this, puts into people's mind in terms of speaking to power, in terms of, telling the truth and digging the truth. So I wish, we have an optimist picture, but I don't think that is what's happening is telling us.
Wow. Wow. This is really sobering stuff. As we near the end, I'm tempted to, I think the African Union has been mentioned at least once since we began this conversation almost 2 hours ago. Uh, no mention of United Nations efforts. Uh, and I'm also very keen on the so-called African peer review mechanism, and I'm trying to write something about it. Are these organizations, including IGAD, doing enough?
Look, there was a peace process that was being led by the African Union that seems to not have, had any or any fruit, right? I mean, it sounds like there was a parallel track with the Kenyan president, and that seems to be the track that is taking hold. I mean, I think the criticism of the African Union is that Ethiopia is their home, right? Addis Ababa is their home, and so it's in a tough place to be able to speak some truth and maybe press some buttons, right? I mean, I think that's the sort of the wide criticism of the African Union. IGAD is, I think it's fair to say that it's absent in all of this. I mean, I think as a whole, right, the mediation process in this conflict just hasn't worked. I mean, the United States is on its third special envoy to the Horn, right, in this short amount of period, and there's still no peace, right? I mean, I think we're closer to maybe some negotiations, right? But there's still like huge outstanding issues in this conflict, right? I mean, from Western Tigray to, to justice for what happened, right? And there doesn't seem to be lots of consistent effort from the international community, from the AU to the EU to the US, right? I think it's fair to say that nothing has beared fruit on this yet.
Getachew, this Ethiopian house we cannot afford for it to fail because of the dire security implications of that in the region. Like we said, Ethiopia is a bulwark for security. What's your take? Are we letting the country down?
Yeah, a very interesting question, Nick. And on the African Union, actually, one of the things that very good piece for journalistic work is what was the role of the African Union, IGAD, in all this. And one of the things what we know is Isaias Afwerki and Abiy Ahmed. The first thing they did was undermining these continental organization, regional organizations. You remember the Mogadishu, Asmara, Addis Ababa alliance. So what they did was they were just, pushing IGAD. In fact, Eritrea has been known for, ignoring anything African Union, ignoring anything IGAD, over the past 2 decades at least, right? So what was new when Abiy Ahmed came to office was, they were looking for another alliance between Formaggio, Abiy, and Isaias, with Isaias at the center. And that had critically, damaged the African Union or any other regional effort there. And mind you as well, Abiy Ahmed is the first Ethiopian leader to skip an African Union summit. The first going to Saudi Arabia with Isaias Afwerki on the day of the summit. So this is, something that skipped, media coverage, all that, but it was well documented by people like Alex Dowell and so on. So there are things that Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Somalia did to undermine this regional and continental. But this is not an excuse at all for the African Union not to do its job. I mean, as an organization, for if you look at what they are aiming for by 2063, I have been looking at the infrastructure plan, the African Union plan, economic, political. It's amazing on paper. And, the African solutions to African problems. It's great. I'm 100% for that. But then when you just take the state narrative and say, this is a law and order operation, and you don't intervene when Africans are suffering, mass rape, gang rape, massacres, and so on, that is, very damaging for the institution itself, for the African, Union principles, all that, and so on. So again, because of the huge task of getting these stories out and digging into what happened, who played what role, and so on, I think the future has a lot of raw material to study and stifle through in terms of these IGAD and continental organizations. Now with Formaggio gone, the alliance is broken, and we know not a lot, but we know some to some extent that Asmara and Addis Ababa are not, at the level they were before, right? So all that is giving some fuel to the African Union to, be again back into what it should have done months ago. And talking about the Kenya process and so on. So if you are looking at individual African leaders like Kenyatta, and others, I think they were doing the right thing, but they didn't have the power to, impart anything significant. But I'm hoping still with their effort, if supported with the right tools from the international community, there is some hope with leaders like Kenyatta, and with his end of maybe in August, I think we might see him as replacing Obasanjo, the African Union envoy, and that would give a big traction. At least that's what I'm hoping, Nick.
Excellent. And finally, something positive about the attempt by Nairobi to broker peace. And I informed several Kenyan diplomats of this conversation, and I hope they're on. And if not, I'll make sure that this recording gets to them, so at least they know that Nairobi and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Kenya is making the right moves, which is enormously encouraging. It's wow. So the two fellas skipped an AU summit, and you said they went to Saudi Arabia, which leads me to ask an interesting question, and I see someone else has mentioned it. Is there a sort of foreign hand, sort of foreign influences in these whole conflicts? in Tigray, and specifically, what's the role of Eritrea and its president Isaias Afwerki in the conflict? And secondly, another question from Facebook: what's the future of Tigray? Secession, or continuation to be part of the country, Ethiopia?
I mean, that's the huge question, right? The huge question, because it also gets to the heart of this conflict, which we talk very little of, right? But it's an ideological conflict, right? Over a constitution, right? And what does Ethiopia look like in the future? Does it continue to be, an ethnic federation, right? Do these different states continue to be nation states, right? And I mean, I think part of the reason this became a civil war is because no one seemed to be having this conversation that everybody obviously wanted to have, right? And I mean, I don't know. I think it would be foolish of me to even try to attempt to say what the future of Tigray is, because that's, who knows. I think we know quite well what the role of Eritrea was, right? I mean, they are 100% a player in this war, right? I mean, they have troops on the ground in Ethiopia who are still there, who, we know are even in Oromia, so they're fully a participant in this war, and they have shaped this war in fundamental ways. So I think that's pretty. We have pretty well established that that the government and Eritrea are working together, and the Eritrean military is all over this country.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, about Eritrea, I think there was a time where Guterres was saying, I heard from Abiy Ahmed there is no Eritrean force, and if you were to speak, Amharic, the Ethiopian official language, you would be surprised, the amount of coordinated denial. They were laughing, Eritrea, no way, it can't be here, knowing it was well planned and coordinated, right? I read, mind you, April was the month 2018 Abiy Ahmed came to office. So we knew as early as June, and specifically on the 11th of July 2018, publicly, Isaias Afwerki talked about political cleansing that should be, happening in Ethiopia, and it was being coordinated by him and Abiy Ahmed. This is in public speech. So, and the game over, the famous game over, speech was as well, July. So within few months, they were into this business of, coordinating at big scale and so on. So thanks to, again, the New York Times, report on the number of meetings and people in the security apparatus of Ethiopia, anonymously speaking to Declan or his team, were, open about this was being planned. And on the Tigray, I mean, again, like Eder said, it's a big question. But if you ask me my reading of what's happening in Tigray, the feeling in the diaspora and within the political elements of Tigray as well, people are thinking about post-genocide Tigray. So in that context, people want to make sure that this is not going to happen again. And is that possible for a Tigray remaining in Ethiopia to avoid another genocidal war on it? Many people doubt that. And mind you, I mean, when we talk about genocide, we know for a fact, as media, the US had that determination made, but is not willing to disclose that yet, right? For political reasons, all that. But we heard, to the European Union Parliament, their envoy at that time, Havisto, saying he heard it firsthand from Ethiopian government leadership. They want to wipe out the Tigrayans for 100 years. This is a direct quote. Havisto, Pekka Havisto, the Finnish foreign minister, and he was at that time the European Union envoy to the Horn of Africa. He said that in the, you can imagine if you hear about this, about another country, another region, another continent, I'm sure, like everyone saying, if it was not Africa, if it was not, just part of Ethiopia and so on, Tigray, this was more than enough for people, to act and to do something about it. But it didn't happen. So the feeling I'm reading from, again, even under siege, under blockade, we have enough to say about what the feeling is at the public level in Tigray, in the diaspora. They are for, going out of Ethiopia, and they see that as an insurance for, because what the narrative we have, Nick, is imagine if Tigray was a country, would the international community, will the African Union would just behave the way it did, the past 19 months? Many question that. Many doubt that would be the case. So the feeling I'm having, I'm reading all over the place is Tigray or Tigrayans. I don't know what the political elements, the leadership and so on are going, because what we hear them publicly, they will be for referendum. They have been asked, at least the ruling party was asked, whether it's going to be for an independent Tigray or not. They are keeping it at the level of going for referendum.
Right. Last question, finally, of the session about the way forward. A two-part question. Obviously, this discussion has been about the deplorable state of press freedom in Ethiopia. And you mentioned of there having been only one campaign on social media, the No More campaign. First part of the question, what's the place of a coordinated social media campaign for press freedom, for transparency, for a humanitarian intervention, for truth about Tigray? And secondly, and lastly, once this conflict is over, what can people do to ensure that journalistic integrity is safeguarded and respected?
I think that's really interesting, because I don't know that there has been a coordinated campaign to demand respect for journalistic independence. And part of me wonders if it would work. I think this is the part of our job where we don't get too much into. There are sort of regional bodies of journalism. There's CPJ, right? Bodies that protect journalist rights. But the truth is that none of it has actually led to much change in Ethiopia. I wonder if a big public outcry for it would do anything. I don't know, right? I think that's beyond what I do. But it's an interesting question. In the future, how do you protect journalism? I think it's actually enshrined already in the Ethiopian constitution. I think you have to have media houses that are willing to take on the government, because I can guarantee that a future government will likely try and do some of the same things, right? So I think part of it is you have to build um, media houses that can withstand uh, attacks from government. And at the moment, um, there are a few incredibly brave media houses in Ethiopia, but they're really small. So I wonder, if part of what needs to be built in Ethiopia is media houses with the resources to go toe to toe with the government.
Get it you.
Yeah, that's a very important question. I think one thing that I see, and I want to appeal to journalists, media houses in Ethiopia, is I think we have enough lessons learned, over the past 19 months. Even if we want to extend more than that, that the victims, victimization or criminalizing journalists has continued for so long that those who were just okay with what the government was doing against other journalists became, with time, victims themselves. So if you look at who was imprisoned, who was, silenced, and so on, it's all over the place. But at one time, some people or some journalists might have thought it's only targeting the other group, right? But that's not the case. So it's a matter of time. It was a question of time before the silencing machinery, all that against media and journalism, takes everyone, and so on. So, and that gives me a hope if and only if everyone is for access, unfettered access to, media houses all over the country, including Tigray. That would benefit, everyone. Like I said, if there is this party or that party, including the state, the government, who is hiding information, misinforming, disinforming, the only way to battle against that, the only way to take on that is by making information available. I want to just mention the experience of Finland. They saw what Russia is doing on Ukraine, coming early on, actually, maybe way some years back, and they started a very successful campaign and media literacy, where they were talking about, okay, how do you recognize, misinformation, disinformation, fake news, all that, and so on. So they were actually, developing a toolbox to inform from KG, from KG all the way, up to the public. And on media literacy, if you just look out for ranking, global ranking, Finland is on the top. And what they successfully did is, again, educating the public, right? So we can educate the public if we have access, as media, as journalists, and so on. So this is to the benefit of everyone. This is in public interest. This eventually, in the real sense, would stabilize, the country, the region, and so on. Doing otherwise, like, keeping silent because the victim or the target is somebody else, another media house, another journalist, and so on, I think we have had enough of that. And we saw that it's a matter of time before everyone is silenced and only one source of, quote unquote truth, that's the state media, and so on. So that is not sustainable, that's not helpful, and that's damaging. That's too much a cost for the poor community, the poor country to shoulder on.
Wow. Amazing, amazing remarks. I was going to ask you to offer your parting shot, and that sounded really great. but the offer still stands for your closing remarks.
I would just echo Getachew. I think we probably, as journalists, if we stuck together a little bit more, we could probably make more of a difference, and it's in the public interest, right, for more of us to be out there telling this story. And I think if we stood up for each other more, it might make a difference, right? Because we're all under the same pressures.
Getachew?
I just want to thank Nick for doing this great job of moderating our conversation. I want to thank Omna Tigray for hosting this, and the Institute of African Studies at Columbia University as well for sponsoring this. So this is awesome, and to be continued.
Excellent. I cannot say anything after that. I was going to say the same thing. Thank you for doing my job. It's been an honor. I've learned a lot from you guys. I hope we continue the conversation. Thanks, Omna Tigray and the Institute of African Studies at Columbia University for this amazing session, for organizing this amazing session, and most importantly, to all who joined us in various platforms on YouTube and Facebook. Stay tuned for more. I'm sure people at Omna Tigray have a few events planned in the near future. So let's continue and keep up the spirit. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.